Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. And as you can see, we're going to continue this topic regarding eugenics and kind of that conservative reaction to World War I, 1920s. But before we begin, as always, take a moment, hit pause on this video, jot down the lecture outline to your right, and pay particular attention to those key terms at your left. Make sure you can identify the who, what, where, when, and why, be able to connect them to each other and their larger historical significance. You got it? Let's get started. Now, one of the big fallouts that we kind of broached in our last lecture from the National Origins Act, the box bills, the burgeoning eugenics movement, was the continued focus on the so-called problem races. Races of people who apparently, in their minds, given to them by God or through evolution based on their racial characteristics or hereditary traits, were disease-ridden by nature. And we talked about this a bit and how they dealt with this in regards to Mexicanos using the Border Patrol to designate all Mexicanos as potential undocumented or illegal aliens, making them to what one historian calls alien citizens. However, the Border Patrol was not the only way. Public health in public health departments became a new rallying cry. And of course, racism abounds. And so people are going to suffer through the 1920s with impoverished, horrific, miserable living conditions. Remember, this is as a result of extremely poverty-stricken. There are poor housing. They live in sheds, in barns. They live in tents, and in some cases, boxcars, which we mentioned previously, like Detroit and Chicago. They are charged higher rents, so they can't get into better neighborhoods. Within their communities, there's still a lack of running water and electricity. They lack paved streets. They lack garbage collection services. They lack sewers. They lack pest controls. There's extremely high sickness and death rates, especially infant mortality rates. And of course, diseases and illnesses include things like typhoid fever, tuberculosis, pneumonia, influenza. And all of this kind of defined and encapsulated these so-called little Mexicos, the barrios, where in these poorer areas of the city. Again, this is not exclusive to Mexicanos, Mexican Americans, Mexicans. No, this is almost every ethnic group. But again, of course, we're focusing here on Mexicanos, and they do have to face a much more difficult stand against this, given the Border Patrol, given the issue we talked about previously regarding racialization. But rather than deal with the real causes of the issues, the lack of investment into these communities to improve the sanitation, to improve the sewer system, to improve the health, to stop the disease outbreaks, rather than realize that Anglos are forcing them to live in these areas due to the racial renting and selling practices. Anglos instead chose to blame Mexicanos, as if somehow the disease that is spreading through their communities, contributing to sickness and death, was somehow inherent to them being, well, Mexican. And these eugenic so-called experts began using local Department of Health and Services, health departments in cities to quote unquote preserve America for true Anglo-Americans. The goal was to promote a clean, healthy, sanitized white vision. This is especially prominent in Los Angeles, one of the foremost health departments of this type in the country. Because Los Angeles wanted to kind of redefine themselves as a clean city for tourism. And again, when I say clean, I mean sanitized white vision. And so all the immigrants in Los Angeles, whether Chinese or Japanese or Mexicano, were this blight, this sore spot that needed to be dealt with. Take as one staunch eugenicist said, Charles Goeth, pictured center. He was a staunch eugenicist and Sacramento real estate broker, concluding that, quote, Mexicans were scruffy and contagious. Eugenically, as low-powered as the Negro, the Mexican peon is, from a sanitation standpoint, a menace, unquote. He then went on to say, quote, he, the Mexican, not only does not understand health rules, being a superstitious savage, he resists them, unquote. He refers to all people of Mexican descent as eugenically lower, as low-powered as a black person, a menace when it comes to sanitation, and even when they maybe could understand rules, they choose not to. Base this on some kind of weird idea that Mexicans were superstitious. That he resists the rules, the Mexicans do. And so this plan to deal with the so-called dirty Mexicans was carried out throughout the nation, including at the border. Let's start there. Remember the Border Patrol, one alternative solution to the so-called Mexican problem that was not being addressed by adding Mexico to the quota system. They transformed Mexican Americans in border crossing Mexican laborers who had for a century yearly circularly migrated into suddenly they are disease-ridden illegal aliens. Stating definitively that, quote, all persons coming from El Paso from Mexico were considered as likely to be vermin infested, are sent through this plant for disinfection, unquote. You see, one health expert, so-called expert, explained that upon entering the building, the bodies were segregated by sex and stripped naked, while their clothing was chemically scoured. A laundering that lasted for 30 minutes to clean their clothes. And then each scalp of each person was examined by a male or female attendant for lice, the vectors of typhus fever. As was common procedure at the time, especially among the school children. If found, quote, the hairs of men or boys was clipped with number 00 clippers, unquote. Women with head lice had a mixture of equal parts kerosene and vinegar applied to the head and hair for at least 30 minutes with a towel covering to hold the chemicals in. Attendants then directed border crossers into sex-segregated showers where they were sprayed with a mixture of soap, kerosene, and water. After this, they would be vaccinated for smallpox if deemed necessary. This border quarantine helped to solidify a boundary line that had previously been much more nebulous, and in doing so helped to racialize all Mexicans or people of Mexican descent as dirty, disease-ridden outsiders, seemingly destined to plague the United States. This was the border. It also happened in schools. Mexicanos who were considered white according to the census and according to jurisdictional standards. They instead were subjected to pervasive and insidious de facto segregation that was often framed by eugenic arguments about mental and procreative fitness. In Southern California in particular, separate schools were part of a broader dynamic of spatial division between Euro-Americans and Mexicanos. When not instituting divided classrooms in urban Los Angeles, the school board, quote, manipulated attendance zones to produce segregation, unquote, during the 1920s and 30s. They started to use IQ testing, not to see who was smarter, but to offer a punitively scientific reason for this two-tiered system to condone and justify segregation and the channeling of Mexican children into vocational training, unskilled labor, and agricultural occupations. So they began to use standardized testing, IQ testing, not as a way to see who was above and beyond, but rather as a way to segregate and separate so-called dumb people, stupid people, and then use that to filter these groups into vocational unskilled labor training. And they did this in a racial basis, knowing that these tests that were printed in using certain words of English that someone from a Spanish-speaking home would not know. And they use that then as justification to not educate the children, but rather separate and segregate them, force them into a lifelong career pathway that is farming or grunt work. This is taking place across the Southwest, using this idea of eugenics to stigmatize and racialize based on IQ testing and standardized testing. Yes, the first standardized tests in this country were not designed to create a equality idea, which is debatable whether they are still or not. They were designed to segregate based on race, class, and ethnicity. In addition, in some areas of laboring areas of California, Mexicano work camps were forced to endure a weekly delousing for employment, all in the name of health. They required Mexicanos to bathe in equal parts coal oil and warm water. This was the procedure for killing lice that involved rubbing coal oil throughout the skin, concentrating on any areas where hair was present. Yes, even in the genitalia area. Public health wanted to tout Los Angeles as a city that would be great for tourism, and they focused on cleanliness as a way to do this. And therefore, areas, these barrios, these enclaves of Chinese, Japanese, Mexican populations were separately and serially targeted as so-called rotten spots. And armed with this institutional power, buttressed by the legitimated ideas and language of so-called scientific objectivity, public health officials developed discourses that attributed the serious health problems confronting minority groups to purported racial ethnic deficiencies that was beyond their capability to change as they were biologically inferior. Let me give you an example. In 1924, in Los Angeles, there was 2 simultaneous plague outbreaks in Los Angeles, bubonic plague and pneumonic plague. On October 29th, 1924, the LA City Health Department began a citywide quarantine. Barrio-wide or enclave-wide. They quarantined a 7-block zone around patient 0. This restricted the movement of 1,600 residents. Dr. Pomeroy, the leader of the health department, described it as, quote, supervision over certain Mexican areas where disease may be hidden, unquote. When I say quarantine, I mean they hired 450 armed guards, 150 for an 8-hour shift, to patrol the area 24 hours a day. The police then added an additional 75 officers to patrol per shift. By the end of the quarantine, the number of guards grew to 675. In other words, 1 guard for every 2.5 residents. When a Mexicano got sick outside the original quarantine area in the so-called Mexican quarter of the city, a second quarantine zone was created encompassing another 6-block radius with another 450 guards. These are extreme quarantine security measures by any standard. There was, however, one glaring exception to the quarantine, the strict no entry, no exit policy that regulated the quarantine zone. Throughout the epidemic, one group was allowed to leave: day laborers. These employees were allowed to, quote, pass on permits and under observation, unquote. The fact that these workers were to be observed suggests that the workers would return to the quarantine area every night. Such an agreement raises questions regarding the health officials' commitment to public health versus corporate wealth. But employers across the city responded to news of the plague by firing all their Mexican employees, many of whom who didn't even live in the quarantine areas. For example, the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles would fire all 150 of its Mexican workers within weeks of the public plague's announcements. Mexican government officials and journalists would have to intervene on their behalf to get their jobs back. Again, this idea that somehow, by nature, racially designed, they are inherently inferior and dirty and disease-ridden, is a long impact across the spectrum of the community. In the aftermath of this outbreak, Los Angeles began to set up Mexican clinics under the auspices of trying to help the Mexicano communities improve high infant mortality rates. But as evidence shows, these clinics were right next to the factories that spewed toxic gases in the neighborhoods. So instead of really helping Mexicano barrios, these clinics instead acted to save Anglos from having to share their facilities with the so-called disease-ridden Mexicanos. As Health Department official Dr. Pomeroy claimed, it was, quote, impossible to mix the Mexicans and the whites in the same clinic because the Mexican hygiene standards were so appalling, unquote. But again, the health providers failed to link the limited resources devoted to the barrios to the higher infant mortality rates. Instead, these health officials blamed the so-called parents' cultural habits and overall ignorance. It should come as no surprise then that California eugenicists continued to demonize Mexicanos as overly dependent on state welfare and as oversexed, procreating families that exceed the normal size of responsible citizens. Charles Goth wrote to Harry Laughlin saying, quote, it is the high birth rate that makes the Mexican peon immigration such a menace. Peons multiply like rabbits, he said, unquote. In editorials, pamphlets, and personal correspondence, prominent eugenicists foregrounded the so-called Mexican problem as a danger to every facet of the state's health. The sterilizations that began to occur at the county hospital were now under the purview of the Department of Institutions. It is estimated that some 20,000 forced sterilizations took place between 1909 and the 1960s. Documents suggest that African American and Mexicanos were operated on at rates that exceeded their proportion of the population. Let me give you an example of this. Although, according to the 1920 U.S. Census, Mexican men and Mexican women made up about 4% of the state's population, they combined for about 7 to 8% of those sterilized. So Mexican men and women who amounted to about 4% of the state's population, it is estimated that 8% of them were sterilized, meaning double the amount that their proportion would dictate. So, I mean, sterilization, we can argue, is bad either way, and there's a whole class on that. But You would think then, though, that if sterilization is being applied equally across the board to all ethno-racial groups, that if your group makes up 4% of the population, then 4% of your population should get sterilized. In this case, 8% of Mexicanos were being sterilized, compared, even though they represent just 4% of the population of the state. And this was done very deviously. So you have to picture this. They would make a woman who's in labor in the hospital sign paperwork, ostensibly to deliver the baby and be admitted to the hospital. But that included a clause that they were signing to get sterilized after the baby was born. So you have to picture this. A woman goes into the hospital in pain. She's in labor. She may or may not speak or read English. She's given these papers to sign and ostensibly read, but then she signs it. And then the doctor will give birth to the baby, help the woman give birth. And then while he's stitching her up, doing any last minute things, he will also sterilize her. She won't even know it until she tries to give birth later on and finds she can't have a baby. Fun fact, it was California's sterilization policy that helped inspire Nazi Germany, whose 1933 Nazi law on preventing hereditary ill progeny, it was partially modeled on the California statute. This is a very devious, heart-wrenching thing to understand. They were targeting Mexican and Mexican-American women and men. Without their knowledge or consent, they were sterilizing them out of fear that if they didn't, that these Mexicanos would overrun the white population. This is a hallmark of white supremacy. The Anglos are so afraid of losing white supremacy that they will go to such lengths as to murder or prevent and sterilize. All on the racist idea that they are eugenically lower. And then we find out that the Nazis copied us and took it to another extreme level. Now, from this position, though, Mexican and Mexican Americans are going to fight back. And that will be the topic of the second half of this lecture. So until then, take care and bye-bye.